Story 1. I was a cop for several years. I was called to do a welfare check one day on an old lady who hadn't been heard from in a couple of days. She hadn't been to work and her neighbors were worried, seeing as she was always quite sociable and getting out. And about we arrived at the house and all of a sudden noticed that all the lights are out. This was during the evening and it had been sunset now for a couple of hours and was almost pitch black. Street lights had come on and it was definitely that time of the evening where you'd have to have your lights on in order to see what you were doing inside the house. The door was locked. Me and my colleague began walking around the perimeter, shining our lights through the windows to see if we could find anything. First I did the living room, as the living room was the front-facing window for the property. Then I went around the back where the kitchen was, and it was there where I found the woman. We saw a body through the window of the kitchen. Initially it was me with my light, but my partner also came around the back and noticed this. We entered the house, but we found a way in through one of the windows that were already open. We called out to the woman to ask if she was okay, but we had no response. We didn't see any movements either, but eventually we realized that her cat was actually eating her on the other side of her body that we couldn't see. Yes, that's right, her cat was just going to town like this was dinner. So my buddy yells at the cat to get away. Well, apparently just when this happens, the lady wasn't completely dead, because I remember she started making a noise. The cat ran off and me and my partner just started absolutely crapping ourselves, thinking what on earth were we witnessing here. Me and my co-worker were scared to pieces, but we now realize we may have a chance of saving this lady. The wounds weren't too deep from the cat and she was still alive. We realized this lady was just catching her breath and that she was still alive, so we called for the ambulance. My coworker said that the woman actually survived the whole ordeal after getting updated, because if you ever have a heart condition or an issue with your health, they will most likely always eat you if you ever die in the house, whereas dogs will sit by you and starve to death. Story 2. My forensics teacher was telling us some of his more memorable moments. He didn't really describe it as creepy, since I think he had learned to block out the scare factor in his line of work. It was an everyday occurrence to see some pretty nasty things, but he was training himself to try and just forget about this. This was actually a lecturer who also was an old British guy. For those who are wondering about accents and preferences, this particular scene was one where a man was recently released from a mental hospital. He was back at home with his wife and teenage daughter as they just let him out. The neighbors had called the cops because they heard him yelling, but the family told the police that everything was under control once the police arrived. The mother just claimed that he was adjusting to being back home and was just struggling every now and then. Well, they went away and then received another call later that same night, but this time the call wasn't from the neighbors, it was from the daughter living with the guy and her mum. Apparently the guy had a knife and was swinging it around, and the daughter managed to run out of the house to use one of the neighbors' phones. This was insane and she was in fear, panicking for her life. When the police showed up a second time, the guy walked out of the house and started yelling at them with a knife in one hand. The crazy guy tried to charge down the officers, but the two cops managed to use non-lethal force and tase the guy, subduing him and getting him to the ground without anyone getting hurt. One of the other cops decided to walk in, and what he found inside that house gave him PTSD and trauma to this day. Apparently he found the lady who was this daughter's mother in the kitchen sink. All her body parts had been cut up and there was blood all over the kitchen walls. When they asked the guy why he did this, he claimed that aliens were going to land, and apparently he thinks his wife had been communicating with them to try and take over the neighborhood. So long story short, this guy should have never been released from the mental asylum, and whoever reviewed him and did the assessment clearly didn't do it well enough, because he ended up killing his own wife for no reason other than one that he made up inside of his psycho head. The daughter was lucky to make it out alive, because I guess he also assumed that she was in on it too. My lecturer had to basically clean up the mess and do forensic testing on the body parts. Story 3. I was an off-duty cop. I'd gone home for the weekend to celebrate Thanksgiving with my parents. I just realized that I couldn't switch off. Being a cop basically had you switched on every encounter in your life. Depending on where you worked and where you were based out of, things could get pretty messy, and you'd always have to be switched on. I kind of had a jealousy towards those cops that worked and patrolled in the nice areas where very low crime rates, but I guess what's the point of being a cop if you're not going to at least experience the high-end type crime and actually be pushed to your limits? I found it hard to switch off, which kind of ties into the story here today. It was Thanksgiving and I'd gone home to see my parents, who at the time were around 65 to 70 years old if I remember rightly. My Dad had just turned 66 and my mom was around 69 or 70. They both lived alone and had a dog. It was a spaniel, and they lived on some country land, pretty rural, far away from the town. Nothing ever happened out there, but it was perfect for them. They liked a place where they could just relax and be away from all the hustle bustle and nonsense of the busy roads of towns and cities. They got quite intimidated by all that stuff, so it suited them quite well, but the issue was it meant that I just couldn't see them as much because I worked in the city, which was a good 3 hours drive away. I tried my best to meet them at least 2 or 3 times a month, but sometimes it would just go months without me seeing them. It was very difficult, but I knew during Thanksgiving I had to make all the effort to get there to see them. As I was getting older, I was spending less and less time with them, so this Thanksgiving meant a lot. I took the car and I left my girlfriend at home. I know seems weird, but she just didn't really get on with my parents. I don't know why, but she accepted the fact that I was going to spend Thanksgiving with them this year instead of with her. When I arrived at their house, again the usual hugs, the welcoming. I said hi to the dog and eventually made my way into the house. Now, on a side note, I didn't grow up in this house. This was a new house they bought specifically for retirement, so I didn't really have any memories, and I still didn't really exactly know every room in this house. It wasn't small, and I wouldn't call it your standard retirement house because it had over 4 bedrooms. I know that wasn't some $1 million property. It was still quite big, and I think it used to be a farm property land, basically a barn conversion or some kind of estate. They had a good amount of land with it, maybe around 10 acres, which where we were as glass is a lot anyway, so we enjoyed the dinner. We had great food and things were really settling down. I spent most of the day just catching up with my parents, telling them about things I've done, witnessed, and how things were going back at home. We joked and laughed about memories as we sat there watching TV late into the evening. The clock must have turned around 11 and my parents went off to bed. I couldn't believe how early they had gone to bed. But then I forgot how they were really getting on. I guess the older you get tighter quickly. But the fact was I was nowhere near tired, and seeing as I just recently worked a few night shifts, I was wide awake still, so I figured I'd stay up at least another few hours until at least 1 or 2, where I'd then hopefully be able to get to sleep properly. I decided to just sit there watching some TV, and meanwhile the spaniel, who was named Coco, sat beside me. We were watching some nonsensical nonsense, and I can't remember exactly what it was, some kind of TV show. As I sat there slouched on their couch, Coco was drifting in and out of sleep. It was clear that he was used to going to bed around 11 just like my parents, but he also didn't like the idea of staying upstairs with them trying to sleep while I still was awake down here with all the lights on. He was happy to see me, and I hadn't grown up with him as he was only around 7 years old, but he was a jolly dog. Nonetheless, as I was sat there with my legs up on the couch watching TV, he was dozing off on his dog bed. It must have been around 1 a.m. and I finally figured I was getting ready to go to bed. I started to feel sleepy for the first time that day. It had been a good Thanksgiving, and I felt good the fact that I'd come back and spend it with my parents, and I think they felt good about it too. There was something great about coming back there and just having the reunion, even if it was just with the 2 of them. I did have a couple of sisters, but they didn't manage to make it down as they were out of the country during Thanksgiving, so we were just about to get ready for bed, and I decided with my parents that I was taking Coco up into my room. That was the guest room for the night. He would be sleeping with me. As I was just about to turn the TV off, out of nowhere Coco gosh, and simply drifting in and out of consciousness and snoring to being bolt upright in his bed with his ears up. I looked at him a bit confused, wondering if this was normal behavior for him. Mom and Dad had both gone to bed, so I couldn't exactly ask them and just wake them up. Because of this, he was acting all strange. He started looking out the window closest to the living room as if someone was there. The bolt upright and his ears on end were soon followed by whining. He began crying at a very loud pitch. I got worried, thinking he'd actually wake Mom and Dad up, but I realized that I should be more worried what he was whining at. Now, I don't know much about dogs, and I don't talk to anyone who have them because I don't know. I'm just not a dog person. But I didn't know whether this dog was actually being serious or just doing one of its stupid behaviors. There's a lot of things dogs can do and a lot of things dogs can also not do, but when it came to whining, a lot of dogs whine just for the sake of it. And I remember my auntie used to have some friends that had dogs, and she'd bring them over to the meetings. They would always whine non-stop all the time over anything, so I just sat there and associated it to that, thinking that maybe now Coco was just another dumb spaniel that would just whine at random things. Oh boy, was I completely wrong. So I got off the couch and turned off the television. I proceeded to turn every light off in the house and then made my way over to The staircase. I called Coco over and he went up the stairs, but it wasn't like your normal run up the stairs. He kept looking behind, still whining at the window. He was listening to me, but he was hesitant to go up the stairs. All the doors in the house were locked for certain, as my dad had made it clear that he'd already checked them all, but I didn't think twice. I didn't care, and I was just annoyed now, thinking that I would have to put up with Coco whining all night and have a sleepless night. Coco makes it halfway up the stairs and then stops like he's refusing to go all the way up, so I decide to walk past him, and I was annoyed at this point, very close to waking my parents up and telling them to have him for the night instead. As I got halfway up the stairs, I passed Coco and he looked at me, still whining. At this point I was almost certain that somehow we would have woken my mom and dad up because of his whining, but it's not like I could have just made him silent by holding his mouth. It was clear to me that he even had serious behavior problems, or well, I didn't consider the other fact until I made it to the top of the staircase. It was then that I heard a faint knocking sound below. The knocking sound sounded like somebody knocking at the door, except it was on one of the windows. As I heard the glass vibrate, I quickly thought twice. You see, I thought to myself, was I just imagining this? Perhaps I was tired, perhaps some of the brandy or alcohol would hit me from Thanksgiving. I reminded myself that I didn't drink that hard and I wasn't one to ever get drunk easily or have hallucinations. So I decided to just be quiet for a few seconds. Meanwhile, Coco still sat bolt upright halfway up the staircase, looking down towards the windows. His whining stopped once I heard, or thought I heard, the first knock. He goes from whining to growling, and at this point I had no idea what to think. I started to take him a bit more seriously and go from thinking it was just a behavioral issue to actually now him being quite a good guard dog with senses. It took around 10 seconds for another knock to occur. You see, this other knock was on the other side of the property. It was to the back end of living room. Also, once again, it sounded like it was on the glass windows. At this point I was almost 100% certain that I now wasn't hearing things, but rather there was somebody out there knocking on our windows. My first thoughts were this could have been a prank, but then I figured that my parents were literally in the middle of nowhere. The nearest house was a good half a mile away, and they had at least 10 to 15 acres of fields surrounding the whole property. This would have been some devout prankster who was committed, to say the least, if they traveled this far out at almost 2 o'clock in the morning to come and knock on some random farm property's door. So I make my way down the stairs and I'm unsure what I'm going to find. I quickly turned all the lights on. I realized I didn't bring any weapons with me, so I was kind of scared. Both my mom and dad don't carry weapons ever. They've always been against them, but me being a cop and now off duty, having random strangers knock on our windows worried me. The only thing I remember having was some mace, and that was it. That wouldn't do much good against someone who was armed. This dog was now whining like mad, so I figured I'd pick up the nearest thing to a weapon, which just so happened to be a knife in the kitchen. At this point all the lights were now on downstairs. I unlocked the front door downstairs and made my way outside. I took one of the flashlights from the kitchen shelves that my parents had propped up, so in my right hand was a kitchen knife, specifically around a 10 inches meat carver, and in my left was the flashlight. Now I know a knife does nothing when it comes to being against a gun, but I wasn't about to win part of this. I wasn't going to go down without a fight, and if someone wanted to prank my parents, they were going to learn that today wasn't the day. Although I could have called for backup, it would have been stupid, pointless, and a waste of time. I would have discredited myself, and being off duty, it was up to me to deal with the situation. I had to investigate what on earth was going on and who was causing this. But for 5 minutes I was walking around the property and found no one. The thing was, there were no trees around. It was just open fields. My flashlight can shine for almost around 100 to 200 meters, and I found no one. The time between the second knock and me coming down to turn all the lights on, get the knife and the flashlight, and walk out the front door must have been no more than 30 seconds. In that time someone somehow sprinted off completely. Well, it's either that or there's no other way to describe who or what the knocking noises were at the windows. I went back into the house after a good 10 minutes of searching the whole thing. I even walked all the way down the driveway to see if I could find any vehicles or anything, but there were no lights from cars or any sign of any humans. This was worrying, and even more so that Coco was whining throughout the whole thing. I went back inside and barely got any sleep that night, continuing to look out my windows for the majority of that morning to see if I could catch who it was.